All right, welcome everyone to our Athena seminar series. Today we have Patrick Rim presenting. He is a second-year PhD student at the Yale Vision Lab, researching 3D vision and multimodal AI systems, advised by Athena PI Professor Alex Wong. He completed his BS in computer science and information data sciences at Caltech, and currently a research scientist intern at Meta Reality Labs, working on the extended reality team with Kun Hei. And with that, I'll introduce Patrick. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for the introduction. So as Rajeshi said, my work is centered on building embodied AI agents with adaptive and efficient perception, as well as multimodal capabilities spanning vision, language, and range sensing. So I aim to develop methods for recognition, reconstruction, and generation. And today my talk will be focused on this line of work that I have on adapting 3D reconstruction models on the fly in an unsupervised manner. So with that, I will begin my talk. So for 3D agents operating in our three-dimensional world, whether ourselves or ones we design and build, naturally reconstructing a representation of our 3D surroundings is crucial to the egocentric spatial tasks that we want to perform, including, of course, extended reality, autonomous driving, and robotic manipulation. So vision in the form of images affords us dense 2D photometric information. But for that third dimension that I mentioned, we can turn to multi-view stereo, which requires motion, or we can turn to another modality, such a range sensor, for example, such as LiDAR and radar, or even a visual inertial odometry system. So to kind of motivate this talk, depth estimation is essential for these spatial applications, but don't just take my word for it. Let's walk through some real-world examples. Autonomous driving, as I mentioned. In autonomous driving, dense depth estimation is important for accurate perception of complex environments. An autonomous vehicle needs a complete understanding of its surroundings, as you might expect, including road geometry and distances to objects. And this cannot be done robustly with only two-dimensional camera inputs. Another application is augmented and virtual reality, where dense depth is important for accurate spatial interactions between virtual and real objects with correct depth relationships. So I'll give you an example to kind of to illustrate this. Let's say a virtual character in AR or VR space walks behind a wall. We know that this should be occluded, but we would need dense depth reconstruction of that wall to accurately render that occlusion. So predicting dense depth in this application also allows for fine-grained object interaction, collision detection, and just general spatial understanding. And in the indoor setting, we of course have robotics, and specifically robotic manipulation, where precise and efficient real-time depth perception can be the difference between success and complete failure for dexterous manipulation tasks. So depth perception can be approached through a wide range of sensing modalities, each bringing its own strengths and limitations. But in practice, robust perception often comes from combining multiple sensors with complementary strengths. This leads me to explore depth completion, the task of predicting a dense depth map given an RGB image and an associated point cloud collected using LiDAR or other time-of-flight sensors, such as radar, or again, using a structure for motion approach, for example, with visual inertial SLAM in an IMU. So for this task, the point cloud is typically projected onto the image plane, where of course images are captured from an egocentric frame of reference, but the projections of point clouds tend to be sparse, unlike RGB images, which are of course dense. And so these complementary modalities with dense photometric information from one modality and sparse geometric information from the other can be used together to predict dense depth maps. The concise definition then is that depth completion is the multimodal task of reconstructing three-dimensional environments from an egocentric point of view in the form of depth maps. So let's take a look at a real depth completion model in action. In this case, we have the Bilateral Propagation Network for Depth Completion, or BPNet for short, published last year. We see here that this BPNet model, trained on the KITTI dataset and evaluated on the KITTI dataset, gives us some pretty good results. So the predicted depth looks all in order as compared to the image, and this error map shows low error in most regions of the ground truth. But let's take this model trained on this KITTI dataset and evaluate it on a different data set, what we would call out of domain, on a data set from Waymo. And we see here that the predicted depth is all out of sorts. The error map is high, with white being maximum error in this region, in the region that we define. And we see that when BPNet is trained and tested within the same domain, as we see at the top, performance looks strong, but the moment we step into a new domain like Waymo, performance collapses. The model just simply doesn't generalize. A basic assumption of machine learning is that the training and testing data should follow the same distribution. But in practice, this assumption is actually rarely met. Typically, there exists a covariate shift or domain gap between the training source domain and the testing target domain distributions. So while domain adaptation can bridge this gap, methods require access to the source domain data, ground truth, or multiple passes through the target domain data. All of these, I want to say, are unrealistic assumptions. Another pervading trend is to curate large-scale data sets with the aim of training on data sufficiently representative of those observed during testing. But this process is costly both in conducting large-scale training as well as in retraining to address failure cases. So this raises the critical question of my talk. How can we adapt depth completion models on the fly? This means without retraining from scratch or relying on labels in the target domain. That's exactly the challenge my latest work on energy-based test time adaptation for depth completion, to be presented next month at ICCV 2025, is designed to tackle. So the important part about the real-world applications of depth completion that I mentioned earlier, such as AR/VR and autonomous driving, is that they operate in dynamic environments with non-stationary data distributions. But continuously fitting a depth completion model to data from novel distributions can cause issues in robustness and generalizability, which are crucial for such user-facing systems. So we want to adapt to test time environments. And the question that we want to explore is, what if the model could self-assess the quality of its own predictions? So we train an energy-based model, we'll call it an EBM, that acts like a critic. An energy-based model will assign a scalar energy value to regions of a predicted depth map that we could do at inference time without any ground truth. So we can do this in an unsupervised manner. We will call low energy regions, we'll term low energy regions as predictions that look in distribution. So in other words, similar to correct predictions from the source domain, implying that this prediction is likely to be correct. High energy regions are areas where predictions look quote unquote out of distribution, which we might call likely to be erroneous or unlikely to be correct, implying that the prediction is, again, likely to be of low fidelity. So throughout this process, we will assume that the depth completion model performs well on training and source data, and that is usually manifested in the form of having a pre-trained model on some source data distribution. So I'll introduce our method, which we'll call ETA, which stands for energy-based test time adaptation. And it comprises a two-step process, where the first process is an offline preparation step. We first train the depth completion model and the energy model on some source data set. And the second stage will be test time adaptation, which is online, done in real time, where we will update the model to minimize the energy of its predictions, aligning the predictions in a test time distribution more closely with the source data distribution, and thus improving the accuracy on the target domain. So to train our energy model, we want to encompass a broad range of variations covering more than just a single target domain. In fact, we'd probably ideally want to cover every possible out of distribution domain. So to train an energy-based model that detects bad out of distribution predictions, we need examples. So we need data of bad predictions, but we only have access to the source data set in this setting of test time adaptation. And this is what we would call a chicken and egg problem. So to resolve this, we can synthesize as in generate synthetic data of out of distribution examples by intentionally making our model fail on source data. So one way to do this is by employing adversarial perturbations. One method to do this is the fast gradient sign method, or FGSM. We can apply this to the source inputs, which in the case of depth completion are the RGB image and the sparse depth. These perturbed inputs cause pre-trained models to produce erroneous depth maps, aligning with our definition of, quote unquote, out of distribution training data for our energy model. So we can see here in this UMAP, this is dimensionality reduction plot of the data that we have. That's our source data set that I mentioned, and some out of distribution data that we have just for the purposes of this plot, and then our synthetically produced out of distribution examples. And we see that using the fast gradient sign method that I mentioned, the data that we generate aligns with the target data that is out of distribution more closely than the source data that we train on. So here we have some examples. We see that during the training of our energy model, we pass in data from our test time distribution, so our out of distribution, or so our test time distribution, and we see that the error map is quite high. And what we'll do in this case is actually assign an energy value per local patch. And so in this way, instead of assigning a single energy value to the entire image, we actually have energy values assigned to each patch, corresponding to how likely is each patch of this image to belong to the source distribution that we have our nice fine-tuned model on. So we see that, well, high energy test time predictions will correspond to the out of distribution predictions that we want to adapt towards our source distribution where we know how to generate high fidelity depth predictions. And so by minimizing energy, we improve the fidelity of our predictions by aligning them back to our source data distribution. And this is a good example here where in just a few iterations of this test time adaptation mechanism, we go from having a high energy regions in maybe this far away portion of the scene that we can see on the top to kind of aligning it back to our source distribution by minimizing energy. And we see that the estimated energy is low, meaning that if we were able to evaluate against ground truth, we would ideally be able to see low error in these regions as well. So some studies that we did in developing our method, we saw that, as I mentioned, we want to have local energy values for patches rather than a global energy scalar for the entire scene. And so we experimented with different patch grid resolutions, and we found kind of dividing an image into 19 by 4 grid of patches seemed to work the best in terms of reducing our evaluation metrics. And we saw that actually increasing the number of adaptation iterations, as we saw in the previous slide, adds computational budget, but may not actually always offer better results. And in fact, in most cases, just a single iteration is sufficient to achieve state-of-the-art results on the benchmarks that we evaluate our method on. As we can see here, we see that compared to existing test time adaptation approaches, this energy model-based formulation gets us high fidelity predictions in test time domains across outdoor and indoor scenes. And in fact, we actually have experiments showing that this approach is sufficient for adapting our model to actually quite large domain gaps. For example, adapting models from trained on an indoor setting, perhaps to evaluating a test time in an outdoor setting. And that might be useful for things like AR, VR, where you don't really want to constrain a user to having to only be present in some limited scope of settings. So here are some more results. We see, and some numbers as well. We see that our method ETA improves over the previous state of the art by, a 6.94% in outdoor settings and 10.23% in indoor settings across all methods. And we see that, so we have a pre-trained model here on the bottom right. And then our method, predictions after adapting a test time in an unsupervised manner with our ETA method on the left. And we see that predictions just tend to be more high fidelity and corresponding to the image in the top left that we see. Some more results here. These are some good examples. So we see that the pre-trained model in the middle row produces some quite erroneous regions in the boxed areas that we highlight. And after test time adaptation, we see predictions that just align, even by the eye test, align better with the image. And we see with our color mapped error images, we see lower error regions as well. This is another good example here in more indoor settings. We have an example on the bed. We have an image of a bed on the left, and we see that the error map, it's predicting just erroneous depth for this kind of flat bed. I guess you'd call it a headboard of sorts. But we see that the error is greatly reduced by adapting at test time without ground truth labels using our method. And so that was test time adaptation, where we can successfully adapt to new unseen distributions in an unsupervised manner. And we can actually augment this unsupervised way of training depth convolution models with a structure for motion approach to, quote unquote, perhaps at least in a theoretical sense, learn forever with a continuous stream of videos. And here's how. So what we leverage in this new way of doing unsupervised depth completion is having observations in contiguous points in time. And so we assume a stationary scene where we want to assume that we don't have moving objects as a simplifying assumption. But if we have multiple observations of the same scene from different points of view, we can use a reprojection to different frames that we have across time to kind of validate the fidelity of our depth predictions. And in doing so, by minimizing the error of such reprojections, we can actually train our depth completion model to actually be quite competitive with supervised approaches for depth completion, even without access to ground truth depth. And so before we go any further, let's actually formalize unsupervised depth completion, which is the core method underlying this line of work I'm presenting with just a little bit more rigor. So depth completion in general can be trained in a supervised manner using ground truth depth, or an unsupervised manner that I'll present here. But since ground truth is prohibitively expensive to acquire, we tend to subscribe to this unsupervised learning paradigm, which enables a model to learn without human intervention. And so existing unsupervised depth completion models are trained and evaluated on single data sets under the assumption of a stationary data distribution. And so let's consider a single data set D. Importantly, these data sets contain no ground truth depth. So in unsupervised depth completion, all current state-of-the-art methods are CNN-based, convolutional neural network-based, including KBNet, which is the current state-of-the-art method, FusionNet, and Voiced, which are methods that we'll work with in this upcoming work that I'll present. And we'll evaluate our methods on 3 different unsupervised depth completion models that I just mentioned as backbones to be comprehensive. And so in unsupervised continual depth completion, which is where we'll be heading, this is a task where we have a sequence of data sets with distributional shifts, or in other words, domain gaps between data sets that I kind of alluded to in presenting test time adaptation. And so each data set contains its own set of input images and sparse depth points, with again no ground truth depth. And as a note going forward, I'll be using the terms domain and data set interchangeably just in this setting. So how are unsupervised depth completion models actually trained then without ground truth supervision? They typically minimize the loss function in the form of this equation here, which is a linear combination of 3 terms. LPH will be photometric consistency, LSZ will be sparse depth consistency, and LSM is a local smoothness regularization term, each of which I'll go into a bit more detail here. So first we have photometric consistency that leverages image reconstruction as the training signal in lieu of ground truth depth in this kind of structure from motion way that I mentioned. So specifically, let's say we have an image IT at time t, and its reconstruction I hat t tau from a temporally adjacent image I tau, where tau is either just t minus 1 or t plus 1, so a temporally adjacent frame given in this equation here, where x bar is the homogeneous coordinates of an image pixel coordinate x. D hat is the predicted depth at that pixel, so D hat of x is the predicted depth at the pixel x. K is the camera intrinsic, the standard 3x3 camera intrinsics matrix. G tau t is actually the relative camera pose between time t and time tau, and then pi is just the canonical perspective projection. So by walking backwards, we see that we're actually assigning high loss when the image warped from an adjacent frame using the predicted depth is inconsistent with the current image, suggesting that we have low fidelity depth predictions. So given IT and its reconstruction I hat t tau from time tau, the photometric consistency loss measures a combination of just the L1 difference, as well as the structural similarity using a metric called SSIM between IT and I hat t tau. Next, we have the sparse depth consistency loss term, which is a bit more straightforward. The photometric reconstruction we just discussed recovers depth, but only up to an unknown scale because we're working with homogeneous coordinates. And so to ground predictions to a metric scale, we actually minimize an L1 loss between the predicted depth d hat and sparse depth z for the image coordinates where we do have sparse depth. And so that's a subset of all the image pixels omega, which is the set of all pixels. So in this equation, M here is a mask that maps the set of pixels omega to 1 if we have sparse depth at that coordinate and 0 otherwise. And finally, the local smoothness regularization term addresses ambiguities in regions where the predicted depth is not constrained by photometric or sparse depth reconstruction terms. We enforce local smoothness in depth predictions as an inductive bias by applying an L1 penalty on the depth gradients in both the x and y directions, but we do want to allow for depth discontinuities along object boundaries, if that makes sense. So we want general smoothness within projections of objects. But across objects, we, of course, to have high fidelity predictions, we would want to encourage discontinuities there. So we do this by weighting the penalties by their corresponding image gradient weights, lambda x and lambda y, where larger image gradients result in smaller weights, allowing for sharp depth transitions along edges that we observe in the image. And so this whole idea of unsupervised depth completion, as I kind of mentioned earlier, suggests the potential to continuously learn kind of indefinitely. So in this example here, we just have multi-sensory observations from an image and maybe a LiDAR that gets us this point cloud that I mentioned. And if we just kind of allow our model to maybe we attach this model to an embodied agent that can kind of maneuver its surroundings, and then just continuously learn from its surroundings and continuously adapt. But as I mentioned previously, existing unsupervised depth completion models are trained and evaluated on single data sets under the assumption of a stationary data distribution. But sequences of multiple data sets or domains that we encounter in the real world actually exhibit non-stationary distributions and are perhaps even captured by different sensors with varying calibrations. And so fitting to new data samples inevitably causes the model to what we call quote unquote catastrophically forget previously learned information, where the model performance degrades significantly on data from distributions that it's observed in the past. So to enable pre-trained models to adapt to new environments or domains in an unsupervised manner, we turn to continual learning, where training strategies aim to mitigate catastrophic forgetting while maintaining the ability to adapt to new distributions. And otherwise, we want to minimize catastrophic forgetting while simultaneously maximizing what we call plasticity to learn from new data in what we call, as you can see here, a stability plasticity trade-off, which can be measured using metrics that I'll introduce later. So one note about continual learning is that it's actually been quite extensively explored for 2D classification tasks, but not much at all for more challenging 3D regression tasks, where we observe actually much larger domain gaps between data sets and distributions, such as this task of depth completion. So in my CVPR 2025 paper called ProtoDepth, sorry, I don't know why it's keep doing it. I present a continual learning solution for catastrophic forgetting that's actually tailored to challenging 3D regression problems such as depth completion. So to position ourselves in the landscape of continual learning, I'll start with a brief overview of key prior work. More importantly, I'll highlight the main categories of existing continual learning approaches. One school of thought here is that we want to constrain updates to parameters that we deem quote unquote important for previous domains based on a regularization term controlled by a weight chosen as a hyperparameter. And so this line of methods is what we call regularization-based methods. One such work, elastic weight consolidation, which is a seminal work in this line of research, shortened as EWC, introduces a regularization term to the loss function to identify and penalize changes to weights that we deem are important for old data distributions, quantified using something like Fisher information. Learning without forgetting is another work that uses a new head, so a new prediction head for each data set, and encourages the post-training outputs of old heads to approximate the recorded pre-training outputs of the head in a knowledge distillation-like manner. But while these methods perform quite well in simpler continual learning settings, such as I mentioned, 2D classification, regularization-based methods can struggle with more challenging tasks and larger domain shifts between data sets. Another school of thought is to incur memory costs by storing previously observed training data and incorporating them during learning of new data, akin to rehearsals. And so these so-called rehearsal-based methods use a memory buffer to store a limited amount of data from previous tasks, allowing the model to periodically retrain on this data during continual learning. Experience replay, one such method, or simply replay, introduces the strategy of retraining a subset of previous experiences or data to quote-unquote replay or retrain on while learning new tasks. And newer methods such as generative replay methods and CMP here, which we use as a baseline, introduce more sophisticated sampling strategies. But the trade-off for rehearsal-based methods lies in the sensitivity of the balance between optimization and forgetting to the choice of a hyperparameter. And there's also concerns about the size of storage and data privacy, especially in real-world applications. Architecture-based methods allocate dataset-specific parameters or even sub-networks, aiming to enable learning of new tasks while minimizing changes to parameters assigned to previous datasets. So one recent architecture-based method called Auxiliary Network Continual Learning, or ANCLE, shows the benefit of decoupling the responsibilities of maintaining stability and maintaining plasticity to separate networks. They introduce an auxiliary network that is free to adapt to new data while regularizing the main network to reduce forgetting. Then the auxiliary network distills learned information to the main network to promote plasticity. But many architecture-based methods require dataset identity to be known at test time, unlike our method, as we'll see later, or they rely on a rehearsal buffer in addition to dataset-specific parameters. Also, architecture-based methods such as ANCLE often introduce actually a significant number of additional parameters for each dataset, which can actually even exceed the parameter count of the original model, kind of defeating one of the main benefits of this whole idea of continual learning. In contrast, we'll see that our method actually introduces learnable prototypes, which have just less than even 3% of the original model's parameters. And so all of these methods that I mentioned actually perform updates to the full set of model parameters as well, which is computationally expensive. And so, as we can see here, this is a real-world example that we see with this method called CMP, which is a baseline that I mentioned. There's actually degradation in the 3D reconstruction of previously learned samples. So this is a good example here, where a pre-trained model can correctly estimate the depth of this, I guess, street sign or mailbox actually that we have here, where the mailbox correctly is predicted to have a depth that's closer to the camera than the kind of houses in the background. But as we can see here, after training, just in a naive fine-tuning manner, we see that this mailbox is actually predicted to just kind of be stuck into the wall of the house. And clearly we see here that the depth prediction is incorrect. So as I mentioned, all of these existing continual learning methods actually perform updates to the full set of model parameters, which is computation expensive. And again, just defeats the purpose of continual learning. And unlike all of these methods, we actually opt to freeze our backbone model entirely and learn a small set of parameters that we call prototypes to modulate the latent features for each new data set encountered. And so here we'll introduce this entire new paradigm of continual learning, which we'll call a prototype-based method. So now I present ProtoDepth, which is a novel prototype-based approach for efficient state-of-the-art continual learning for multimodal 3D tasks such as depth completion. So just as a little bit of preliminaries, all current unsupervised depth completion models, I think I mentioned before that they're all convolutional neural network based at the moment. But in general, they all have this dual encoder-decoder architecture with one encoder for each input modality, the image and sparse depth, and then skip connections between corresponding layers of the encoder to the shared decoder. So as terminology, we'll define the latent space as the bottleneck layer as well as all of the skip connections here. And so that'll be important terminology as we go forward. So to explain how this method works, let's first consider just a single input sample from a single data set at a single layer of the latent space, which is encoded into the latent features X of shape H by W by C, where C is just kind of like the channel dimension or the dimensionality of the feature space that we're working in. So we'll flatten X actually to get queries Q of shape N by C, where N is just H by W. So importantly, since the encoders are entirely frozen, Q serves as a set of N deterministic queries, where each query is a C-dimensional vector. And then we'll introduce P learnable prototypes, which are akin to values in scale dot product attention, which a lot of you are probably familiar with, where each C-dimensional vector represents a prototypical local feature of the data set. And so to learn the keys associated with each of these P prototypes, we'll actually define and learn a projection matrix W that learns to map the prototypes P back into the query space, which is the latent feature space. And we actually found that by learning a mapping between prototypes and queries, it's actually more efficient in terms of number of parameters and equally effective compared to learning a separate set of keys. Additionally, we found that kind of the stop grad operation here, which blocks gradients from flowing back from the prototypes back to the keys, facilitates this kind of decoupled optimization where we enable prototypes to learn appropriate additive biases while keys just learn to assign relevant prototypes to the queries. And using ablation studies, we actually found that this improves performance as well. So finally, going back to our feed-forward architecture, we compute the similarity scores between the queries Q and the keys K using scale dot product attention, which are then used to compute a convex combination of the prototypes P, which serve as our local additive bias that we add back to our latent features. So to model this kind of global transformation, we'll learn a C-dimensional multiplicative prototype D applied element-wise, which can actually be implemented efficiently as a one-by-one depth-wise convolution. So now we can define a prototype set, which is again more terminology, for a given data set and a given layer of the latent space to be the local and global prototypes P and D, as well as the projection matrix W. And so since the model is frozen and a new prototype set is learned for each new data set, this naturally facilitates continual learning and ensures zero forgetting in the domain incremental setting, where the domain identity is known at test time. Since, of course, we can apply the prototype set corresponding to the known test time domain. So up here, we denote that the test time domain identity is given in this incremental setting, as we can see by that kind of known database that we represent with that figure up at the top. But how can we actually extend our method to the more realistic domain agnostic setting, where the test time domain identity is unknown, which is actually more in line with real world applications that we would see? So if test time domain identity is unknown, then we can't just simply select the corresponding prototype set during inference. And so to address this kind of challenging scenario, we'll introduce what we call a prototype set selection mechanism that learns to choose the most relevant prototype set for a given input. And so for an input from a data set, we can deterministically, since the encoder is frozen, obtain a sample descriptor by applying just a simple global average pooling or gap to the bottleneck latent features with channel dimension C. And so for any given input, we can obtain a sample descriptor, which is a C-dimensional vector. The key observation, again, so to emphasize this, is that since both encoders are perpetually frozen, so the bottleneck features will always be a frozen deterministic function of the input throughout this entire continual learning process. Then for each new data set, what we'll do is deploy a new domain descriptor and freeze all existing domain descriptors that we might have learned up to this point in continual learning. And each domain descriptor is also, again, just a C-dimensional vector. So they add negligible overhead in terms of number of parameters if we're keeping track. So the deployed domain descriptor is actually trained by maximizing cosine similarity between itself and the sample descriptors for the data set that it's assigned to. So the domain descriptor for the domain that we're learning, while maximizing the cosine distance to all other learned domain descriptors. And so by doing, which again, we froze. And so this actually naturally yields domain descriptors that are discriminative, maximally discriminative across data sets, allowing us to use the projection of a sample descriptor onto the domain descriptors as a prototype set selection mechanism, where, again, during inference for a given input, where we might not know what domain this input belongs to, we select and apply the prototype set corresponding to the domain descriptor that maximizes cosine similarity with said sample descriptor. So here's a two-dimensional t-SNE, a dimensional reduction plot of sample descriptors and domain descriptors for our indoor dataset sequence, which consists of the NYUV2, ScanNet, and Void datasets. So we see that while most sample descriptors align closely with their respective domain descriptors, as you would expect, we actually see some overlap here. So for example, these green points here, which are embeddings of data samples from Void, actually are closer to this red star, which is a domain descriptor for the NYUV2 dataset, than it is to the domain descriptor of the Void dataset that it belongs to. And so actually this kind of overlap enables cross-domain generalization and actually improves performance in some challenging scenarios, which we will see down the line. So just so we can accurately gauge the kind of performance that we'll see down the line, we'll briefly introduce our evaluation protocol. So we'll evaluate on a sequence of indoor datasets as well as a sequence of outdoor datasets with large domain gaps between datasets. For example, due to varying sensors and calibrations. And in the outdoor dataset, we see that we go from Waymo, which captures real world scenes, to VKitty, which stands for Virtual Kitty, which is a dataset of synthetic examples. So we have a kind of real to synthetic domain gap as well. So for each of these dataset sequences, we're going to train on the base dataset, which is just the first dataset, and measure performance on this base dataset. Then we'll train on each successive dataset in our dataset sequence and measure forgetting on old datasets, as well as performance on each new dataset. So performance is going to be measured on all data sets and summarized. I guess it can be summarily evaluated using these average forgetting, average performance, and stability plasticity trade-off metrics shown here. So average forgetting will show how much our model forgets on each new distribution as compared to performance on the original base distribution that I mentioned. Average performance is going to actually measure some kind of balance where we actually just compute the average of performance across all data sets during the continual learning process. And then the stability plasticity trade-off metric here, which I might kind of mention as the most important one here, actually measures this balance between the balance that I mentioned earlier that we have in continual learning, where we want to make sure that we are not forgetting on previous distributions, but also able to adapt appropriately to new distributions. Because of course you can naively freeze the entire model and not update any weights at all. In that case, we would of course have no catastrophic forgetting because our performance would never change. But then again, we would never be able to adapt to new distributions. And so by kind of measuring this harmonic mean that we see here between stability, which is performance on previous data sets, and then plasticity, which is performance on new data sets that we're adapting to, and then kind of measuring that balance, we're able to accurately gauge how well our continual learning method would be doing in more realistic settings. So for our results setting, for the results that I'll be presenting here, for ease of terminology, proto-depth will refer to the performance in the incremental setting that I mentioned, where data set identity is known at test time, while proto-depth A is going to refer to performance in the agnostic setting, so the domain agnostic setting that I mentioned, where data set identity is not known at test time, which is perhaps more realistic and practical. So actually, going back to what I mentioned earlier with the generalization, actually what's most interesting is that in this example here, proto-depth A, again in the agnostic setting, actually exhibits comparable performance and even outperforms proto-depth in reconstructing certain regions of the scene here. As we see, for example, in this smooth curtain that we see in the top left of this image, we actually see that the error in this region is actually lower when we use the agnostic version of our method, as opposed to kind of training while knowing the identity of the domain that we're adapting to. So how is this possible? We see that actually, well, to answer this, we're going to refer back to this t-SNE visualization that I touched on before. This improvement can actually be attributed to proto-depth A's generalization ability, which allows it to dynamically select prototypes from overlapping domains based on its affinity to other domain distributions. Other domain distributions kind of measured by its affinity to domain descriptors, which actually enhances its ability to handle ambiguous inputs. So for example, here, we might be seeing an example, a manifestation of this example where some data samples actually align more closely with the distribution of a different data set, as opposed to the actual data set that it belongs to. And so here, by actually doing this continual learning in an agnostic manner, we're not actually enforcing this hard constraint of having to use the prototypes that it learned for the distribution it belongs to. And so if it actually aligns closer and aligns more closely to a different distributions, it should be free to use and employ the prototypes that we learned for that distribution. So we can see this quantitatively as well. Using the UNCLE benchmark, which is established for unsupervised continual depth completion, we find that our method actually reduces average forgetting by over 50% compared to baselines, and improves these more metrics that focus on the stability plasticity trade-off by 5.15% and just over 6%, respectively, to achieve the state of the art. And so in this indoor setting where domain gaps between data sets are perhaps a bit smaller compared to maybe outdoor data sets, since indoor scenes maybe tend to be more similar than outdoor scenes, maybe you get smaller distributional shifts between different capture settings, both photometrically and geometrically. Maybe we also see more overlap in the kind of objects that we see as well. We see that actually proto-depth A outperforms proto-depth in some of these metrics here in this table. So on the left-hand column, we see different backbone models that we're evaluating with just for comprehensiveness, and we see that in all of these evaluations, we see that proto-depth A, again evaluated in the agnostic setting, actually outperforms counterintuitively a setting where we kind of give our model more information. And this is actually the most interesting thing to me, where we can attribute this to this ability to generalize across data sets. Going to more of the outdoor evaluation in the outdoor setting, we see that unlike Kitty, which consists exclusively of daytime scenes, this Waymo dataset that we're going to kind of continually adapt to includes many evening and overcast scenes. Also, Waymo was actually captured using a higher resolution camera, which means that the same object would appear bigger in terms of the number of pixels occupied. And so due to this kind of large distributional shift, the model forgets the projected shapes of objects in Kitty after training on Waymo. So this is a scene from Kitty that we evaluate on with a model after adapting to the Waymo dataset, even if the objects exist in both datasets. So this forgetting is quite apparent in the highlighted street signs and lampposts here that we can see, where the baseline methods, each of these baseline methods that we evaluate struggle to accurately predict the depth of these street signs and lampposts, whereas our method in both the agnostic and incremental settings is able to kind of reduce this forgetting effect that we see here with baselines and accurately predict their depth. And so even though replay, which is one of the baselines that we see here, does yield an improved error map compared to maybe some of the other baselines, we still see that experience of forgetting in some small surface area objects, such as, again, the highlighted sign lampposts, as well as the small fence poles that we see on the bottom right. And actually, this example and explanation is perhaps my favorite way of validating our approach, which is that replay fails to reconstruct the upper portions of the street sign and lampposts, as well as the poles, due to forgetting of learned photometric priors from the Kitty dataset, whereas our method is able to recall them from Kitty prototypes. So all in all, we find that our method reduces average forgetting by 50+% compared to the best baseline, as I mentioned, and improves both average performance and stability plasticity trade-off by over 7% across all dataset sequences that we evaluate on here. Actually, we do perform a more comprehensive evaluation. There are more comprehensive evaluations available in our paper if you find that online. And so we actually do evaluations across indoor and outdoor scenes as well, which, as you can imagine, is actually quite a challenging task. It represents a much larger distributional shift than you would get from going between indoor scenes or between just outdoor scenes. And so even in this very challenging setting, we see that even though, of course, the amount of catastrophic forgetting is going to be higher than in just in the simpler settings, these metrics, we show using our metrics that we can greatly reduce that catastrophic forgetting effect even in such challenging settings as compared to what's out there in the literature. And so this is a nice little demo that we have at the top here. CMP, which is maybe the best existing baseline for continual learning, demonstrates some quite severe catastrophic forgetting as we continually adapt to new data sets. Whereas even during the continual learning process, we see that our method is able to maintain a reasonable ability to predict geometry even as we adapt to new distributions. And so some kind of final things about this method. So one of the coolest things about ProtoDepth is that it's actually architecture agnostic. So while, as I mentioned, all current unsupervised depth completion models are CNN-based, so convolutional neural network based, our method can actually easily be applied to transformers, which are, of course, all the rage as well. And that's actually just what we did by adapting a U-former, which is a transformer unit, for unsupervised depth completion. And in fact, by doing so, we're actually able to compare to a recent line of continual learning methods that I didn't mention before because they're actually specific and only applicable to transformers, which is this line of work called prompt-based methods. So in the same vein as learnable prototypes, are learnable prompts using continual learning for vision transformers, where the model itself is similarly frozen. So these prompt-based methods actually introduce learnable prompts that aim to encode task-specific information. So as an example, learning to prompt, or L2P, which was presented a couple of years ago, learns a pool of tokens from which a set is kind of selected and then prepended to the tokenized input of, in the case of vision, would be tokenized images. But these prompt-based methods are actually designed for 2D classification tasks that use vision transformers, borrowing the concept of prompting from the field of natural language processing. But the idea of prepending prompts to tokenized inputs along this kind of sequence dimension doesn't actually naturally extend to convolutional neural networks, where we instead have spatial dimensions. And so you can imagine it doesn't really make sense to prepend kind of learnable prompts in input space along a spatial dimension of an image. And so this kind of limits their applicability to 3D vision tasks where convolutional networks are primarily used, such as the one we discussed today. In contrast, our method actually learns prototypes, which serve as representative features that are applied in latent space, offering a more intuitive mechanism for adding a lightweight selective bias than prepending these kind of abstract prompts in this kind of low level image space. High level kind of coarser image space. And unlike prompt-based methods, our method's actually fully architecture agnostic and can be applied to any model that has a latent space without actually modifying the underlying architecture. And so if you recall, we actually flattened the latent features of a convolutional network to get queries of size n by c, which happens to be a very generic shape and the same as a sequence of tokens in transformers. So to validate this hypothesis that we have, we actually went ahead and implemented L2P for unsupervised step completion using the adapted U-former that I mentioned. And we actually found that our method reduces average forgetting by over 50% compared to L2P and improves both average performance and stability plasticity trade-off by around 14%, validating protodepth as the current state-of-the-art method for unsupervised continual depth completion. So finally, a really interesting observation, at least to me, is that since, again, protodepth is applicable to any model with latent space, it is actually also task agnostic. And what do I mean by that? So that means this idea of protodepth, or this prototype-based continual learning, is that it can actually be used for continual learning of many different tasks. So as just one example, we could extend our framework to the task of continual neural radiance fields or continual just general 3D reconstruction that can represent maybe an expanding large-scale scene without forgetting previously learned parts of that scene. So thank you all for listening. That concludes my talk on adapting 3D reconstruction models on the fly. In summary, while test time annotation yields generalizable and robust models without assumptions of the test time deployment environment, we find continual learning as the solution to the kind of catastrophic forgetting effect that occurs when we adapt models. So thank you again. Thank you all again for listening, and I'd love to hear any thoughts or questions.
Thank you, Patrick. Questions? You can also write them in the chat.
Yeah, I guess if that's, I mean, I'm happy to receive questions just offline as well. I think I can probably provide like an email address or things like that, and I'd be happy to connect with anyone as well.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Patrick.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Take care.
Oh, what? Patrick.
It's okay. I was just a curious thing. I can actually reach out to him across the way.
All right. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah. Thanks, Rajeshi. Appreciate it.